G'day everyone, welcome back to the Talking Leadership Podcast. This is Eric Perez, your podcast host. Thank you again for joining us. So by way of introduction, my guest brings an extensive background in leadership. His current roles include the Vice President, Executive Consultant with the Leadership Pipeline Institute. He is also a Director with Arthingworth Consulting Proprietary Limited and also brings many decades of experience in the HR field. Can I welcome to the podcast, Alan Muntz. How are you, Alan?
I'm well, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Today is particularly focused on yourself, Alan. So how about we start from the logical starting point, which is your leadership and its beginnings, mate. Over to you.
You had me reflecting a little, Eric, on that. And I guess when I think back on it, it's a case of it's sort of come over the years. And in fact, I did something with the Best Practice Network. I think it was early this year or last year, and we did a webinar essentially sharing sort of leadership thoughts, etc. And when I reflect back on it, I come from, I guess, leadership in my world, and so when I reflect back, where did I start in leadership roles? And if I look at that, it was sporting type environments, community environments, and then in corporates. So for me, I guess the motivation was always wanting to make a contribution. From an early age, it was me and my mother, and my father died when I was young, but I saw my mother being involved in her church and community. She was a district nurse. So, and with people around me, I guess I saw people being involved in things, not just sitting back and letting others do. So for me, I guess it's come from an understanding or a desire to make some form of contribution. And then trying to take something forward and improve it. So my first leadership roles, I guess, was captaining the first 11 hockey team at school and other sort of rep teams, involvement in the community when our children were young through kindergartens and P&Cs, that sort of stuff. And then in the corporate world, once I started my career in human resources, as that career developed, I ended up managing initially teams of myself and one other to managing corporate HR teams. For instance, I was the HR director with Blue Care for a few years, so managing the corporate HR function. So that's an organisation part of Uniting Care. That's an organisation of 10,000 people, 250 sites, and our corporate HR team was fairly diverse. So it was leading teams like that in the organisation, and it's not just leading the HR team, it's being an effective member of the executive teams and making a contribution, being hopefully a thought leader for your function and taking the organisation forward. So if I look back on it, that's my path to leadership in some ways, and where I've learned a lot of lessons. And I remember reading the Simon Sinek book, and the first start with why. And if I sum it up, my why is trying to help people, be it CEOs, business leaders, or individuals, make more positive futures for themselves and others. So from a leadership perspective, I guess that's where I come from. If I see an opportunity or a need is help take that forward and achieve that.
Thanks for that, Alan. And in some ways, you've helped define, in some senses, your view of leadership. And I'm definitely going to ask you, how do you define leadership? And you've given me a glimpse into that. I guess where I can nuance the next question and just sort of digging a little bit deeper if we can, is that you're at a point in your career trajectory, and I'll make your LinkedIn profile available for those that are listening so they can see some of the things that you've done, and no profile is going to encapsulate everything about you, but you would have met a lot of leaders in your time. To what degree do you think the people you have met shaped your thinking around leadership?
Interesting. I hadn't really sort of given that one much thought, but when we were doing the Best Practice Network podcast, we started with the premise of who are leaders you respect, or what does good leadership look like, and looking at people you respect. And if you recall those conversations around that question, a number of us on the call were saying, well, perhaps we looked at those that we didn't think were great. And for me, it's a combination. And I look back on the people I respect and felt supported by, and I don't know if I've tried to model what they've done, but I guess it's about, for me, for those looking at those people, it wasn't about themselves. It was about taking the organisation or the part of the organisation or whatever they were leading forward. And I was about to say that the people they were in charge of. I'm not an absolute Simon Sinek devotee, but one of the ways, I think it was him or was another sort of writer in the space, was saying the people you're in charge of, or it's the people in your charge. So the people you're looking after in a lot of ways.
It's an interesting one. I like that. I'm always keen to sort of dig a little deeper, and I've met a lot of good leaders. I've met a lot of mediocre, and I've met just as many bad. And I think I've learned something from all of them now. Some stay with you more than others. So I can easily recall the best leader or leaders that I've ever met. And I learned a lot from these individuals, but I also equally remember the very worst that I've had and sort of what not to do. And I think for me that school of hard knocks and living life and being in a role is in some senses the only way you're going to learn what that looks like and smells like and feels like. Define leadership for me from your perspective.
And look, I'll go back to what I said before, and it's quite intuitive of you that where I was heading was, I guess, an introduction to my definition of leadership. And so before we got on the call, I just spent a little bit of time, and I think for me it's just in reflecting on my experience or my path to leadership, as was one of your notes that you provided earlier, was for me it's seeing a need or an opportunity and trying to fulfill that or achieve that with others. So I recall working in a small organisation. It was between my time with Company United Breweries before I went into not-for-profit health. I worked for with a little entrepreneurial business. It was a bit more than a startup. It was doing civil contracting work, and it was led by two entrepreneurial types. And I still remember standing in one of their offices overlooking our shed where we had tractors and equipment. And I said, guys, if you don't really love that down there, you need to let someone else take it and drive it. Because these guys were entrepreneurs that were then looking for the next opportunity, how they could diversify the business or what was the next business that they could go into. So I think, from a leadership perspective, you really do have to have a clear and passion is one of, there's a number of overused words in my view, like pivot and authenticity to me are things that have become very much overused, and passion's probably another one. But you've really got to have a love and a desire for the thing you're about to, and an understanding and an engagement with it that you want to take it forward, and you want to drive that. I'll use the word. You want to drive that passion into your team. From a leadership perspective, it's about seeing that opportunity or seeing that need and really trying to be quite persistent in achieving it. But you can do that as an individual for around individual topics, but to do it collectively is much more engaging, much more fulfilling. And it's about leadership to me is about then driving that thing forward with others. And there are different aspects to leadership, like there's political leadership, there's community leadership, there's thought leadership. And I think it's about, if you think just about thought leadership. So in a corporate sense, if you are the marketing person or the HR person or the finance person, you're there to drive that agenda. You're there to drive that functional agenda in the organisation so that the organisation can achieve its goals. So, for where I've come from within HR, it's about driving the thinking and the behaviours around how we lead and manage people and engage people so that we create the outcome. So it doesn't matter what the organisation's there for, we're going to achieve it through our people. So my role as a senior HR practitioner and in a number of my roles sitting on the executive team, being a member of that executive team, not just being the HR guy, but also I'm an opinionated little prick. So, I will comment on or make contributions into other areas. I won't just stick to HR, but, our role then is to try and engender an understanding, a new set of thinking and really a new set of behaviours around the things that will engage our people and help take the organisation forward. So, there's a thought leadership piece as well, not just not just leading people, but it's a thought leadership around trying to drive those things and change behaviours in organisations so they are more effective. That's a bit of a waffle, sorry.
No, mate. And it's driving more and more into the grey matter that I've got, that this is complicated, it's nuanced, and it's multi-layered. You make a choice to be a leader, so you then make choices to contribute and to have your ideas tested and investigated and taken apart in some senses. And I think that builds character in you because, one, if you agree with what's being said, great, you've hit the nail on the head. But if someone doesn't and they take it apart constructively, constructively, and I mean being constructive, obviously, it'll help you to learn. Unfortunately, and maybe I'll get your thoughts on this because I wanted to go with this question for a little while and has been thinking about this, obviously, when I'm talking to people, that do you think, probably a better way to put this, have you encountered leaders, without naming them, obviously, that you find are resistant to having their thought processes unpacked? And how have you dealt with that?
Look, only rarely. I've been fortunate in a number of the organisations I've been in where I've had, especially when I've had those senior leadership roles, leading the HR function. I've been fortunate to be in a position where I think, and I hope there's been mutual respect with the CEO and other colleagues and myself. So we've been able to have those more introspective or more challenging discussions. There have been times where there's been a couple of leaders where that hasn't occurred. You're going to ask me a question a little later about emerging leadership issues, and for me, so with LPI, the leadership pipeline, in a corporate sense, it's one of the best leadership models I've seen, and it actually generates change in organisations if they take it on significantly. What's missing in that model for me is the things around that self-awareness, the simple things around emotional intelligence, and some of the key competencies around emotional intelligence in a workplace sense and in a general sense is self-awareness and self-regulation. If you go and look at Mr. Goleman's 5 or so competencies that have a significant work impact, self-awareness and self-regulation. And that is about being open to understand how you're impacting your environment, how you're affecting the emotions of others, and taking that on board. And I think that for the future, where I've come from, we haven't focused on those competencies enough, in my view. And I think as we see generational change and we see societal change, I think the need for things around that self-awareness, self-regulation, the impact you have on others, etc., being able to handle your emotions and being attuned to the emotions of others is a thing that we need to spend time on. I'm doing a little project with an organisation at the moment. We're looking at their supervisory group and first defining the role, and it was just the other day I ran a series of interviews, sort of more senior guys and guys closer to the ground, and I was impressed by one of the guys closer to the ground. He said, "You've got to be attuned to your team. You've got to be able to read them. You've got to be able to support them when they're having issues." And so there's a greater awareness, I think, in some individuals that you really do need to be aware and support individual well-being as part of your leadership, so you can take your teams and groups forward.
Before we go on to the next topic, just one thing to say about that. I didn't give this much thought until we did the podcast through the Best Practice Network. And in one of the sessions, this came up, but I started thinking about not just from the leader perspective, but from those that we lead. How often are we what we're doing, and whether or not we are effective at what we do? When do we get the feedback from those that we lead? So the views of the led is often not a topic area of much engagement, because at some point, those that we lead want to have a step up and do what we do, or do it better, or do it somewhere else. And what are your thoughts there? Is that ever crossed your mind, Alan, as a professional in this space?
There's a whole topic here around followership. So what makes a good follower? Because not everyone wants to be a leader. So there's, I guess, I've gone and dug around the leadership about followership, but very much there. That's a whole other topic you could get into about what makes a good follower, et cetera, et cetera. The debate around, well, we've got generational change, and these millennials, or whatever the other generations are now called, .commas, et cetera, et cetera. If you go back and you ask people what do they want out a job, what do they want out of an organisation, et cetera, and millennials will say this now, as go back and think about when you first entered the workforce. What do you want? You want to know what you've got to do. So you want to know what you've got to do in your job. What's the goal of it? You want to know how it relates to the overall organisation. Because if you don't, I can't remember where I heard it, I think it was a young Aboriginal science guy on the ABC News this morning. Purpose and something else. It was 2 Ps, but one of the things you want is purpose. So you want to be able to understand how your contribution feeds into the broader organisation, and then you want to know, well, is someone looking out for me at work, and has someone got my development in their mind, and how can I then develop? And a lot of the communications research will say, who do you want that person to be? Well, you want it to be your boss, generally, right? And that really, if you go and ask the .comers, the millennials, and they will probably, and I've done this in a small group with one of another networking group around manufacturing excellence, and we had a young guy from Muntz there. And I said, so tell me, what do you want? How does this list of things fit with what you want out of your job? Said, yeah, that's essentially it. So even with the generational changes, people are still wanting those same things. They want to know how they're contributing, what they need to do, are they doing okay? Am I going to develop here, etc. The only change is their desire is that's going to happen quicker than it has for others in past generations. So I started my career. My first HR job was a city council in New Zealand, and I started that probably in the last months of '79, just before I met my wife in the South Island in 1980.
Wow, I was all of 5 years old then. Oh, yeah. Wow, okay.
Yeah. So back then you wanted to see yourself progress, but the timeline of that now and your view on career has changed. I was just, as I told you before, I was out playing golf this morning and chatting with a guy. The difference between our generation, he's in his mid to late 50s, and the younger generation are prepared to make those moves earlier. They're prepared. If it's not working out here, I'll go somewhere else. From a followership perspective, or from a leader perspective, what do your people want? It's that list of things, and you just have to be aware that they probably want it now. And you've probably got to find ways of, in some ways, either sating that desire or holding it off by keeping them engaged in other ways. So it might mean that you need to start talking to them about more horizontal career moves and vertical career moves. You need to start talking to them about, well, let's see if we can broaden your skill set by giving you opportunities in X, Y, Z projects, etc. I don't think things have changed significantly in what people want. The cadence, the speed of what they want is nuanced with societal changes as well.
It's an excellent point that you bring up, the generational question. I guess the nuance for me and what makes this constantly interesting, that when I use the term emerging leader, I don't put an age bracket there. So you could be a professional in your late 50s or early 50s that suddenly gets the capacity to move up in a business or in an organization or in a not-for-profit, wherever you are, to take on more leadership roles. And suddenly you are, in my definition, an emerging or a very new leader, not an existing leader. And so the generational stuff then adds another level of complexity to that discussion.
In my career, some of the hardest roles to select for are those new entry roles. So the hardest roles probably in selecting an apprentice, not an adult apprentice, but apprentices from sort of the post-school years. And things have changed since I've had to play in that space within school programs and things. And the reason for that is you don't have any life experience or other things to actually benchmark against to say, has this person, one, got the potential or the desire? So in recruiting, there's a simple little thing you're looking for. Can they do it? Will they do it? Do they fit? Right? Can do, will do, fit. And, well, they can do it maybe. Will they do it? That's the big question. And then fit, because they've got to learn how to interact in a workplace, which is different to a school or institution. But on the other hand, for someone that's been in the workforce for a while, have they had a range of different experiences, or have they had the same experience one day? A 38-hour week is 1976 hours, right? Annualized. So have they had 1976 hours of experiencing the same thing over that year rather than having a difference? When we've had success in recruiting or selecting younger people for roles, the people that have generally, if I reflect back on a couple of people, and both young females, both young female HR graduates, but they were able to demonstrate some form of life experience, some form of broader thinking, and they came in and were successful. But if I then think of, actually, I'm going back to a young lady we selected, we put into a reception role in one of the not-for-profit health organisations. She came in with a great little resume, done an HR degree, etc. She couldn't handle a reception role. So it's that. But I also think about back in the mid-90s with Company United Brews, I transferred to Matilda Bay in WA, and we were running some workplace reform work. And still remember the guy's name. He was great. Great guy. Didn't end well, but he was a great guy. And there's a whole other story there about values, etc. But I still remember he was part of the consultative committee through this workplace reform activity. And he would say, well, if I was a foreman, I'd do exactly as the stuff I'd seen my previous foreman do, which was archaic leadership. So even, if you've got a degree of experience, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to go forward effectively. And again, just to harp back on the LPI stuff, it's about, and it's some other work. Hogarth and Carter did some work as well back. They published it a year or two ago, and it's called The Mind of a Leader. It's very much about a mindset change. It's very much understanding that what made you successful in the past isn't necessarily going to make you successful in a leadership role. It's about understanding that you've got to do some different things and change your mindset and do some different things as a leader rather than a doer. And it's putting time and effort into valuing those leadership activities and skills. There's lots of leadership models out there. It's simply making that shift in your thinking that this is a different role. So if you're the operations, the operations manager of a manufacturing organization, yes, you've got to be competent in your sort of production planning, your sales and ops planning. You need to know, you need to either know enough or have people that know enough about how the widgets get made, and you need an understanding of that. So the technical things, so we need best practice network. We need to know about continuous improvement. But at the same time, you're leading a significant part of an organisation which is made up of a lot of people, and so you've got to put time and effort into the things about leading those people. And that is not just the technical stuff. It is about the things I was talking about before. It's about understanding that people want development. It's about understanding that you've actually got to set standards and manage performance, because if you don't, other people get pissed off because someone's shirking. It's about having people that can delegate effectively and follow up and engage. In one of the training programs we run, we actually sort of have people say, all right, think of the time you were most engaged in your work and think about what those things were. Now, who has control of that? And the Gallup research, they've come up with a number of 70%. They say your line manager has 70% of influence, 70% of the influence of the engagement of the individual. So if your leaders and managers in your organization, and we've got this, is it leadership or is it management? The moment you put into a management role where you've got people in your charge and you have to get results through those people, you've got to do some leadership stuff. So it's a moot point in a corporate context, whether it's leadership or management, from my perspective. But you then need to have people understand and value their leadership role. And if you don't, you're not going to succeed as a leader or a manager, and your part of the organization is not going to succeed, or it's not going to be as effective as it could be. And, that's, again, Simon Sinek's talked about this concept of transition. The Hogarth and Carter work that came out a couple of years ago talks about needing to change the mindset, and that's an underpinning philosophy of the leadership pipeline model as well. If you think about it, so if you think about your career, if you'd just done the technical stuff in a management or a leadership role, would you have succeeded? When I've done a number of presentations to different groups, and I often, if I'm talking the leadership piece, I'll ask the question. So, think about the issues on your desk at the moment. How many of them are people related? And you'll see the nods, and people say it's probably 50 or so percent. How many of them wouldn't be as big an issue if one of your managers had done their leadership work earlier? And you'll see the nods again. So it's about people understanding that a good chunk of their time and effort is really about people. It's about how you engage people, how you set the standards, how you go forward.
The leadership pathway, the progression of leadership is about making decisions and being accountable. I've termed this the lonely road of leadership. Is it a lonely road, or is it as lonely as you make it?
Like the second piece is it as lonely as you make it? And I think that, thinking about it now, I think you're right. Because when I reflected on this, was, is it ? And yes, you're ultimately accountable. And, there's been situations in my career where I've delegated work, but I've ended up being ultimately accountable for stuff. And yes, you've got to make some tough decisions. Right? As the leader of an organisation or part of an organisation, at times you've got to differentiate. You've got some choices, and sometimes you'll have to differentiate or make a decision that, I think it was Abraham Lincoln, was it? You can please some of the people some of the time, but you can't please all of the people all of the time. Often in leadership roles, you've got to make a choice. And yes, you could say that puts you in a different space. It sort of steps you sort of away from your team or away from other parts of the organisation. But to your point, or to your, I think, rhetorical question, is, it's as lonely as you want to make it. Yes, you need to recognise that, but there are ways you can moderate or mitigate that, explain, you don't just be perfunctory in your decision-making process. I've listened to you, I've heard it, I've weighed it up, I've got the facts, etc., etc. Here, we're going to go down this road. It may be a different road, but we're going to go down this road for these reasons. Context changed, priorities have changed, whatever. So I think it is in roles as you come through. I think your comment is you can make it lonely, or you can be more collegial or supportive. Because the CEO role is, especially in publicly listed companies, is probably a lonely role. It's a sandwich role. You're leading the organisation, but you've got the board, and you've probably got conflicting priorities. Especially if it's a commercial listed company and you're on the quarterly results treadmill or the share price treadmill, could be fairly lonely. I still remember going and talking to someone about an issue, and he made the point that the higher you go up, the higher you climb the tree, the narrower the tree gets at the top. And so, your collegiate group changes. It may get smaller, it may get tighter, but I think you can, even though you're ultimately accountable for your part of the organisation, and at times you've got to make some tough choices. I think you can still engage with your team or teams, because remember, as a leader of a team, especially as you're going up through an organisation, as a leader of a team, that's not the only team you're a member of. So, if you're what we would call a leading other, you've probably got a range of peers that you form a team that reports to your boss. If you're on the executive team, and I was doing some work with a little maintenance company that sort of supports mining organisations, and I said to one of them, so which team are you part of? Are you part of the team you lead, or this team, the executive team? Oh, the team I lead. Really, you really need to, again, this is another piece of part of the leadership pipeline theory, I guess, is if you're a functional leader or an executive leader, you're part of the broad business management team, and you've got to take that role that effectively, be across the performance of the business and make a contribution to that broader business and take the business forward. So, your predominant team should be that exec team, but then you're leading another team where you've got to make sure that they go forward as well and they're cohesive, etc. Now, whether one takes priority over the other, up for debate, but this concept of multiple team membership. So you might be making some tough decisions in your part of the world or in front of your team, but you also have a peer team that you're part of, being the exec team or whatever it is.
I like the discussion there around the multiple teams that you're in. And when you think about it, in some organizations, you will be part of multiple teams, and others you won't, or there'll be some hybrid combination of those things. And navigating that. I guess, I can't disagree. And what I will very strongly agree with you with is that the higher up you climb, I guess, the narrower that pathway is. And really, ultimately, when you get to roles like CEO, executive director, or chair of a board, yes, you've got a team with you, but sometimes the decision making is going to be yours, and that can have all sorts of consequences for you as an individual. But I think you can make the decision making process a lot easier if you've got processes and systems in place to help you make informed decisions. Now, that's not going to happen all the time, and I'm not for 1 second naive enough to think that there are some decisions that need to be made quickly, and you're not going to have the luxury of a group meeting to weigh up the pros and cons. You're going to have to use, I don't call it a gut call, I call it more an informed decision based on your experience in the business, and those calls get made every day. Some are more pressing than others. Let me segue to the next section, if I can. This stems from the conversations we've had to this point, is measuring success. Now, I've prefaced this in other podcasts, and I'll do this with you as well, that I can understand where people will say, well, the KPIs are this, that, and the other, but I'm talking about measuring success beyond KPIs. And do you measure success that way, or is it strictly about your KPIs in a role, Alan?
Are we talking about measuring success of the unit you lead, or are we talking about measuring how you would rate yourself as a successful or otherwise leader?
At that level, yes.
So I don't think in that case it's really KPIs. I think it's more heuristic. It's more subjective in a lot of ways. And for me, I guess it's an understanding of how, and I'm reflecting on the last team I led within Ludowici FL Smith. You know, it's about the mutual respect inside the team and the sense of respect you feel that they have for you and you have for them. And in some ways, for me, this is something I hadn't popped into my head until now. And I've always taken the view that I've tried to make myself redundant and been fairly successful at that on a couple of occasions, actually. But anyway, in a broader sense, I've always tried to develop the teams that I've led to a point where they don't necessarily need me to be there to be effective, and tried to help people develop their careers so that they could go forward. And from that perspective, I think I've had moderate success. Not always, and we always learn. There's been situations over my career where something's happened that I've taken a significant learning from, maybe a negative event, a negative consequence to me, or other things that I've reflected on and hopefully learned from. But I think it comes down to the subjective sense of the respect I have for my team, and hopefully the respect they have for me as a colleague and as a leader. When I think back to that FL Smith Ludowici team, we were a regional HR meeting here in Australia. So regional being FL Smith's international company. So we had people from Indonesia, China, etc., etc. And I'd been part of a broader HR meeting some months before, and we'd run this particular exercise. So I sat out when they were doing that exercise in this regional meeting. I sat out, and when I came back in, they said, one of the things that my team had said is they enjoyed working in a team with myself, because the things they said was, you tell us where we've got to go. You give us feedback individually as a group, and you give us opportunity. There's you play to our strengths essentially. You give us opportunities to do different things. And I walked away from that feeling really gratified. You don't often get that level of specific feedback, and it came as the nature of the exercise they were doing. And for me, that was more how I would measure the success of my leadership and my participation with them as a colleague.
Thank you for sharing that. I guess the ultimate test for how effective you are is when you can get that kind of feedback from those that you lead. They have purpose, they have some meaning to what they're doing, and they've had opportunities to do something else with their career. Now, again, assuming that everyone that goes to work wants all of those things in some combination, because I have met people in my life, very interesting, very clever people that look at work as just a means to make an income, and they don't want anything else out of the work experience other than they want a secure job. They'll do that to the best of their ability. Then they go home and they switch off completely. And I envy the people with that mindset, because I wish I could do that, but sometimes I find it's difficult to switch off the grey matter at some points in time. I think it's the nature of me rather than the nature of people. Alan, let me ask you, I might switch the order of the last two topics here, because I want to get your sense of emerging leadership issues. Now, again, in our previous conversations with the Best Practice Network, I had a few inklings to what I think you may go with this, but I'm hoping you throw a few ones that I haven't identified, because I have my own views on what I think are emerging leadership issues. But again, going back to the premise of the podcast, it's about you, my friend. So emerging leadership issues, what do you think they are?
I'll go back to what I said. Some of the things I said before is that individuals and organisations, their basic needs haven't really changed. The context has changed. That we can't. If you go and look at TV from 50 years ago, comedy back then, or some of the shows back then, and I was from New Zealand, so I didn't know about Number 69 or whatever it was. Those things wouldn't. Well, I was going to say those things wouldn't necessarily fly, but there's a thing on TV now called Love Island Australia that just stuns me in this time of Me Too. So the context has changed. So for me, it's the speed of change and being able to deal with that. It's the social connectedness that we've got and the impact technology is having. So there's a couple of things there. There's technology is changing, so the way we interface with that technology in an organisational sense or otherwise, and harness that to take us forward is one thing I think leaders need to understand and work with, because there's probably great opportunity there, but there's also probably a bit of risk because of this level of connectedness. Go back to some people just can walk away from work and switch off. Well, in the level of connectedness today, that's very difficult. And if you don't turn the notifications off on your phone, they'll bing through the night. So there's those things. And what's on your Facebook profile or your comments back when, they're going to haunt you for the rest of your life. So, and this thing about I've got so many friends on Facebook. Well, they're not really your friends. So there's all of that, I think, that's going to impact in how leaders work with their people about what the understanding is around that and where the issues are and where work needs to stop and private life, but how your private life impacts. We had, and I haven't been in an organisational role for 3 or 4 years now, but we terminated people for comments they made on Facebook because it was a male-dominated organisation, guys welding, spannering, moving heavy stuff around, and they were bullying each other on Facebook. And because we had screenshots and that was unacceptable, and someone hadn't behaved appropriately in the workplace in the past and had a track record, that was a final straw. We terminated based on a Facebook post. So there are the implications of those, and that's the real pointy end of it. And then there's this, going back to number 96 or whatever it was, wouldn't be acceptable on TV now unless you're buying it, downloading it through the internet maybe. But this concept of diversity, focus on well-being, green versus our current government not taking on climate change targets, etc. All of those sorts of things are issues that we didn't have in the past. So I think they're going to impact organisations more and more. So gender diversity, ethnic diversity, political correctness, and it's not just, and I say that not from a negative perspective, but from a realistic perspective. Sexual orientation, religious orientation, all of those things, they're more prevalent and prominent and create a different environment that we've got to work through. So people have got to be, and I don't want to say careful, but that's really at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to.
Looking back on your leadership pathway, so if I was to put the following to you, what would Alan say to a younger version of yourself about being a more effective leader?
Reflecting back on, sort of key lessons, key comments, etc., that I've received in the past. And look, I think it's about probably being a little bit more open. I'm an INTJ on the Myers-Briggs. So, it's a case of probably being more empathetic, listening a bit harder. There's been times where I've taken exceptions to things and made that known, or and it's probably, I'd say keep doing that, but probably try and understand. The unfortunate thing is probably understand the politics a little bit more. But be a bit more open, listen a bit harder, be a bit more empathetic, but still you still need to be able to make some of the harder decisions on occasion. And the harder decisions would be make some of those harder decisions.
Alan, thank you for your time. Before we do go and I sign out for today's session, which has been, mate, it's been a pleasure speaking with you on this again. I'd like you to, if you can, give us a bit of a plug as to what you're doing at the moment and let people know how they might be able to get in touch with you, mate.
Oh, thank you. So the Leadership Pipeline Institute is a leadership development organisation here in Australia, around the world, and I represent them in Australia. And from my perspective, that having seen it operate in an organisation as well as provide services through LPI, it is one of the most effective and transferable leadership programs I've seen. And I actually look to represent them in Australia, seeing how effective they were. So that's the LPI side. Arthingworth is my little consulting company, and I do leadership development, executive coaching, HR consulting, general organisational consulting, across a range of sectors, calling on my 30 plus years in HR, but also in senior leadership roles. And you can get to me via simply, I don't run a website. You can get to me through the LPI website, which is the lp-institute.com, or my email address, which is alanmuntz01@gmail.com.
Excellent. So thank you for joining me. For those listening, I've been speaking with Alan Muntz. Alan, thanks again.
Right away. Thanks for having me, Eric. It's been enjoyable. And yes, we could have spoken for hours.
Thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you all on the next podcast.